small group with a high presence in New York. So it would be really great also to receive from those of you on the calls that work at national level, local level, in the regions, in direct advocacy with your governments there, to also hear your thoughts, your advice, and your input into the work that we're doing at the global level. So this is really a little bit the purpose of the call. We have quite a nice group of people who registered for this webinar, about 66 people registered, and we really have a great diversity of organizations and of countries represented here. We have countries like Zimbabwe, Gambia, India, Panama, Kuwait, and Georgia. I realize that maybe not all of you are on the call now, but it really shows that there is maybe a need also at the global level for information in all regions about this process. So maybe I'll go a little bit into the agenda of today. So we'll start out with a sense of the politics. At this moment, we're midway through the process. We have had 3 rounds of negotiations, and we're facing another 3, with the next one starting in the week of the 14th of May. So I think this is really a good moment for us to have a look at how did the zero draft look like, what have we seen governments do with that first zero draft, and how does the first revision look like now? What are the issues at stake, and what should we be doing in the next 3 rounds? Like, what could be our strategy as civil society moving forward on some of the trickier issues, for example? So we'll start a little bit with politics, and we have a few of the really great organizations and people with us who are working on that as well. So I'll gladly hand the floor to them when we talk about the politics. And then I'd like to zoom in a little bit on civil society action and some of the activities and initiatives that are moving as we speak. But before we go into that, I definitely want to welcome the IOM Civil Society Liaison, Colin Raja, who would really give us a little bit of a sense of where the process is and how civil society can participate in it. So really grateful to have Colin as well on the phone with us today. And then I'm really glad to announce that we have Liora Danan on the call with us, who is the Chief of Staff of NYC's Major's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And I heard that that Liora's schedule is a little bit complex today, so we'll shift the agenda a little bit around and maybe give her the floor after the general introduction of the process so far. So I'm going to switch the agenda a little bit around, if that's all right. Maybe on the technical side, for those of you who don't know GoToMeeting, I can see that everyone is now muted. So I think this is really the best thing to do, since we're now almost 30 people on the call. That would avoid some of the background noises that would make it harder to hear. If you have questions, so we'll have 2 rounds of Q&As throughout the agenda. You are welcome to unmute yourself and speak out, or type a message in the chat box. We'll also be looking at the chat box for questions. We are going to record the webinar today, because what we really want to do is also spread the information that we share here and that we hear from you to a wider audience of people who haven't been able to join us today. And we'll publish it on our Facebook page of the MADE network. So that being said, maybe I'll just give a few words of introduction on the process so far, and then I would be happy to give the floor to Liora, if she's on the call.
I am. Hi, just joined.
Great.
Sorry to be late.
No worries. Hi, Liora. So glad to have you on this call. All right, so I'll just start with a few words of introduction on the process. So as I said, we're midway. We're in between round 3 and 4. We've had an interesting past couple of months, with a first zero draft on the table in February, which many of the civil society organizations thought was quite ambitious, really still respecting the spirit of the New York Declaration and really having a wide range of policy proposals in there. So I think in general, there was a positive sense of a good starting point. And this was a very different approach than what we saw at that time in the GCR process, where UNHCR adopted a rather cautious approach in starting with a minimal first draft of the GCR. Then in round two, after round one, the co-facilitators really sensed that the room wasn't necessarily ready yet to go through all of the objectives, and that such an approach would really risk breaking the document down. So they decided to take a step back and to focus on 4 different issues in round two. Basically the differentiation between migrants and refugees, between irregular and regular, between, not the differentiation, but zooming in more on implementation and capacity building, and then follow-up and review, because they sensed that these issues were really the ones that needed a bit more in-depth debate. And I'd be curious to hear from others on this call, but I really sense that this was a good decision, a good call from them, and that quite a number of governments in the room took up this leadership to go along with that strategy of thinking a bit more broadly and not so much in terms of text proposals. So then in the last round in April, we had the first draft on the table where the co-facilitators had inputted the proposals from states from 2 rounds of negotiations. And I think many of us thought that they would have had incorporated much more of the more problematic language that we had heard in the room. And so far, they have really tried to keep the spirit still high of the document. So I think many of us were quite relieved. But on the other hand, there are, of course, certain concerns in the current text, because obviously the co-facilitators had to respond in some way to what they've been hearing in the room for 2 rounds before. And maybe just to give you a hint of the main changes, throughout the entire document, the co-facilitators really made the document softer in its language in terms of respecting the sovereignty of the national state. This was really a call that we've heard throughout the 2 rounds. So basically, for example, language from promote had been changed to take into consideration throughout the entire document. There have been some changes into the access to services section with some very strange wording such as necessary services and necessary human rights. And I think we'll hear a little bit more from Kadri just a bit later on this call about that. Mixed migration has changed quite a bit in this new draft. Basically, most of the reference to mixed migration have been taken out. And this is particularly visible in the section on status determination and the right to seek asylum, where some of these references have been entirely taken out. Yeah, and then not so much changes, but still a few concerns is that the section on implementation is really still quite unclear. It's quite vague. We have 22 objectives, which is huge. The big question is, how are states going to implement this? Is it going to be very much a pick and choose kind of menu, which we heard from some states? Is it going to be, is there going to be a division between what is already in human rights law and what is really optional? It's really still out in the open, and I'm not sure whether we are going to get to a more clear sense on that in the negotiation. So it might actually have to be for after. But that being said, I would really love to invite Leora to speak a little bit about the role of local authorities and of cities in this process. It seems that you have been gathering a consortium of cities to really work on the GCM and to advocate for a number of priorities. And I think this is also really needed. We've heard on some of the objectives, some of the states in the room really lacking the knowledge of what is already being implemented at the local level, what good practices already exist. So I'd be really, really interested to hear a little bit more from you. So thank you, Leora.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a great overview, and happy to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing with cities. I'm the chief of staff for the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and I'm joined on the line by my colleague Emily Ruskin, who also works in our office as a fellow here this year, focusing on our international portfolio. And we, we are overall responsible here in this office for ensuring that the city of New York is offering policies and programs that further the well-being of immigrants in this city. We have now been working for 4 years with a domestic coalition of 175 mayors called Cities for Action, which was launched to push collectively for a pro-immigrant agenda, take advantage of the collective voice of mayors. And we advocate together and share best practice on domestic issues related to immigrant rights and inclusion. With our national coalition, we've been increasingly working with cities around the world who are interested in sharing information with each other, sharing ideas, and ensuring that our collective voice and experience is heard. And that consortium has that network has been building up over the past months. We met last September with a number of other partners. We hosted more than 50 mayors and senior immigration officials at a global mayor summit during the UN General Assembly on this issue. And that was an opportunity to speak with top UN leadership about some of our ideas and concerns about the global compacts. And since then, we've stayed connected with this network of cities and have a sense of shared purpose in protecting and supporting our immigrant residents, and have been thinking about how we can, leverage our collective voice in ways that we otherwise could not have that kind of influence. So in December, when the US administration withdrew from the Global Compact on Migration, we joined with a number of other major US cities in signing on to an international cities letter to the co-facilitators on the GCM to indicate our continued interest in the multilateral efforts and our shared values related to a new vision on global migration. So since then, we've been working with this network on a joint city submission to the GCM, and I'm happy to speak more about that, but in brief, it asks for clarified reference to local authorities, fuller recognition of the importance of local government in policy development, and integration of all levels of government in the implementation phases as well. So we are getting sign-ons onto that submission right now. We anticipate that submission to go informally in the coming week. In the meantime, we're going to be having an informal dialogue with the GCM co-facilitators on Monday, on May 7th. And we'll be using that opportunity to share our ideas directly, and we are also working with like-minded member states to help promote these ideas, to have them help promote these ideas in the negotiations. And we're also supporting parallel efforts to integrate cities' views into the Global Compact on Refugees that's being led by Sao Paulo, and New York has really been taking the lead on the GCM efforts. So that's a big picture overview, and we're happy to be connected with you all and happy to answer any questions along the way.
Thank you so much, Leora. That was really a great brief, but condensed overview of what you're doing. And I know that you're tight on time, so I might just open the floor for a few first questions to you, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Can I ask a specification quickly? This is Kadri from Pico, from based in Brussels, in Belgium. It was really interesting to hear that you're doing this initiative. It would be great if civil society could also see your submission and to see where we could support that towards the governments, because we actually received a request from the Belgian government to specifically asking what our position on cities and local governments is in the GCM, and if we have some suggestions where we could strengthen and how we could strengthen that. And that question came to us as quite a surprise, although we do have we work with cities and local governments, but we hadn't really thought about it in that context, and it was interesting that it came from the government itself. So it would be great to see that submission and to see where we could support each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We would be absolutely happy to share the language with you all to be more closely synced. The Belgian delegation has been very interested in our ideas and receptive to sharing those ideas in their inputs as well. So that's definitely an area of opportunity, and we'd love to connect with you all to help increase that effort together.
And maybe others from the floor with questions to Leora?
Hello, Leora. Yes, this is Elena from Alianza Americas in Chicago. I was wondering whether you are familiar with any other cities that are pursuing similar initiatives or that have reached out to you specifically to ask for some guidance so that they can go forward with this. Thanks.
Other cities?
Yes, other cities. Anywhere in the US or abroad.
Yeah, we are working with a network of cities that share our values and our views, and we have collectively developed this this submission. This is not just a New York City submission. We've developed with other U.S. cities, including Chicago, LA, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, many others, as well as smaller cities and cities that might be less in the limelight, with European cities, Barcelona, Milan, London, Athens, Bristol have all been very engaged. Sao Paulo, Montreal, and Quito have also been leaders, and increasingly trying to connect and work with cities in the regions that we are just sort of naturally less connected to, but have also been leading on this work, like Amman, Kampala, and trying to increase our reach. So we're working with a whole network of cities.
This is a question to ask if San Antonio is also included in this, because I believe that our city would like to be involved.
San Antonio is involved in our Domestic Cities for Action Coalition, so they definitely have received communications about the Global Compact. Emily, do you know if they have signed on?
Austin, Texas has, and San Antonio has not. So if you do have partners on the ground in San Antonio that you would like to raise it with, we are more than happy to have support in outreach and advocacy to any city partners for any cities on the call, because we realize that we're only one avenue of outreach. And so the more we can get this message out there and include as many cities as possible is great.
Yeah, let me just reiterate that we would love to have your help in reaching out to your contacts and networks in your cities to get city sign-ons. You know, we have a robust set of relationships, but there's a lot of cities, so we would, if anyone wants to connect with us, perhaps contact information can be shared after. We would love your support.
Thanks. Can I just suggest for the European cities, you probably know Euro cities. It's actually a big organization connecting all the kind of city governments, and especially they have a working group on migration. You already mentioned Barcelona and Milan, the ones that are more active, let's say from the perspective that civil society would be supportive. But yeah, you could kind of approach many at once through Euro cities. So I'm happy to facilitate that if you don't have that contact already.
Thank you. Yeah, we are connected. We're definitely trying to work through networks and not just through individual cities, because that helps. And certainly Barcelona and others have been helpful in making those connections. I don't know, Emily, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, so we have done a little bit of outreach through Euro cities because our partners in Athens are currently chairing the subcommittee on, I believe in English they're calling it the undocumented migrants. I forget, but Athens, Barcelona, and Milan closely engaged and have helped to connect us. So thank you so much for that suggestion, because we would really love to connect more closely with those cities, because we know that they, through their efforts, have shown to be like-minded in these policies and programs. But any suggestions for other networks, we would love to connect after this call, because again, we know there's hundreds of thousands of cities around the world, and we're only able to connect with some. So thanks to everyone for helping with the outreach.
Yeah, thanks, Leora and Emily. Just a question, because in the chat box we're receiving some questions on whether there's already something available. As I understand it, the joint statement is currently being circulated for sign-ons from cities, so it's not yet available. But is there anywhere already some information that people could refer to?
Yes, I think we should be able to share the language. Let us loop on the best way to do that. In general, the kind of the framework I mentioned is the basic framework of the the submission, there's definitely a focus on the need to clarify terms and ensure that when there's reference to local actors, that there's a distinction about local authorities and recognition of the role that local governments play because of their democratic mandate and their particular responsibilities. And then we highlight objectives 7 and 17 on safeguarding human rights and ending all forms of discrimination. And we emphasize that that doesn't stop at a certain level of government. And we also outline on objectives 15 and 16 that the importance of localities in helping to create inclusive community, or the centrality of localities in helping to create inclusive communities through safety nets and social cohesion, and that is something that happens locally. So those are some of the big picture ideas in the submission, and I'm sure that we would be happy to get the language. The formal submission should again be pretty soon, but we should be able to share with some folks informally as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and then we'll stay tuned to hear more about that and to see more about it. And I think in general we'll really have to keep each other. It would be great if we could keep each other posted, because I think some of the issues will really start to get a better sense as of the next round of negotiations, which of the issues are really going to be at risk in further drafts. And maybe there's even a possibility that we look at some action together as well, or at least strengthening each other's action. So thank you so much for joining us on the call. I realize you have to leave, but I hear Emily is willing or is able to stay on to the call. So yeah, thanks so much, and I think we'll be in touch.
Thank you. Thanks for the time on your call, and we really hope to sync up more and stay connected.
All right, so let's get back a little bit to the politics so far, and to where we really want to zoom in a little bit on what's happening what are the dynamics in the room, how are governments, what's the mood, how are governments positioning themselves on the issues, but also how are government coalitions starting to take shape. And to take us a little bit through that, I've invited a few people on this agenda item to talk a little bit more about that. And as a first speaker, I'd really like to welcome Berenice Valdez from the Instituto para las Mujeres en la Migración in Mexico. And Berenice has also been very closely involved in organizing and leading the civil society regional consultation in the Americas region. So Berenice, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, everybody. I just want to share what I have seen from IMUMI and from Bloque Latinoamericano in the negotiations. I understand that more or less all the people in the call is familiar with the process of the negotiations that we are having. If not, please let me know if I have to make a little more introduction. But in general, there are 6 rounds of negotiations. It begins in February and it finishes on July. The first 3 negotiations were very close. It was the started point was the zero draft that the co-facilitators made. And the first negotiations round was more like a dynamic of listening and expressing the agree on the points, objectives, and following mechanisms of the draft. But as well, it was like a first pointing of which themes or which objectives were not agree with some states. The participation was at the beginning as European Union. Africa was not as a region. Asia neither, and Latin American was not as a region as well. Can you listen to me? Hello?
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Latin American was not participating as a region. because, well, we know that at the beginning, not all the states had the instructions of capital, and not all the states were the position were dialogue between them about some positions. So it was difficult to have a participation as a Latin American bloc of countries, for example. No, the role of Mexican government as a co-facilitator was very difficult to have a first approach in the first round, at the beginning of the first round, and in all the process of consultation, to have a position as Latin America. The absence of the Caribbean countries, in all the process made at the beginning made that difficult as well. On the other hand, Mexico had the focus. Well, first of all, it's important to say that, as we know, Mexico and Switzerland are the co-facilitators of the negotiation of the compact, but they had participation as states as well. So, in the case of Mexico, there has been the participation of middle level of Mexican government in capital, and there has been a lot of meetings between different ministers of Mexican ministers in Mexico, no? And they have worked with the civil society, with us as civil society in Mexico, and well, that makes they have the view, and they express that they didn't want to make blocs at the beginning or coalitions. They wanted to have a common understanding and follow more or less what the co-facilitator said, that there is a document, the first documents in United Nations about migration, who is going to give guidelines, and that is not bounding, but there's an understanding, no? And they wanted to point practical guidelines in this document. So at the beginning, they didn't want to make this block and separate between origin and destination countries, and trying to make all more holistic, they said. But then, as the negotiations have been developed, it has been making a coalition, an alliance, and at the end of the first round of negotiations, and as well as a result of the unfortunate participation of the Hungarian government, which had a xenophobic and of course non-human right approach of migrants, well, there was two results. Now, the dialogue between the Latin American countries, but not just between them, but with other regions and with other countries, and it was more on the like-minded group. Then the like-minded group, it is a non-formal group. It has a leadership from Brazil and Mexico, clearly, but it is the objective that they have said is that they wanted to bring the common understanding on common points on migration, to make a safe, orderly, and regular migration, and to work on that common understanding. That they and they don't want to go back and to the regression of what all the system of United Nations has already, no, in migration. So it is like that how the like-minded group born, no, and the idea is to have the different approaches from different regions, no, and trying to make a balance with the European group, because now they are not as European Union, but they are as European group, no, because of Hungarian participation. So they wanted to make a balance. They are trying to get closer with the African group that it came. The African group begin at, if I remember well, in the second round. At the beginning, African participation was not a group. This group is all Africa except South Africa, who has a very unfortunate participation there as well. And they are trying to get links with another regions, with Asia as well. I'm going to tell you which are the countries who are in the like-minded group. Almost all the Latin Americans, but not all. Cuba and Venezuela are not there, for example. And some others from the Caribbean neither, but that is because they are beginning the participations from the last round. No? And there are Philippines, Bangladesh, Liechtenstein, Canada, and Nepal, New Zealand, and the Latin Americans, but not Cuba, Venezuela, and some Caribbean countries. And the Holy See is part of the group. They participate in the meetings, but they are not signing the declarations that they are doing. And this declaration they are doing to show that there is a common understanding and to try to give the proposals, no, from different states, and trying to break that that origin and destination dynamic. No? At the last round, well, I'm going to go faster. At the last round, it was important to mention that it has been more groups and more thematic groups are growing in the room. No, there is the children friends group with different countries, like a group of 6. There are another group which is the desertification group, that it's a new group, and it is beginning to have more participation from the Pacific Island. And it has been talking from the like-minded group to have more participations. Every member of or participant of this group could invite anyone from another regions, and they negotiate bilateral, but as well as group, and they have a list of countries that have a lot of points of common. But there are some countries, it is interesting because they are negotiating even, for example, if they mention a convention or not. Some countries doesn't want to mention the International Workers Convention, and others doesn't want to mention the CEDAW Convention in the preamble. I mean, it is not talking about specific demands or proposals or guidance, but they don't even want to mention the convention. So when they negotiate, as I can see in that meetings, they are negotiating every point, no? The preamble, the principles, and of course the risky points, which has been 4. The first one is, some countries, as European Union, Japan, Russia, China, South Africa, Norway, Hungary, all these states doesn't want to have the anything that said the mixed migration flows, the asylum seekers or refugees. They are not considering the link between the refugees and migrant compact. Some countries don't want to talk about irregular migrants. Even they don't want to talk about regularization. The last round finished with the Europe, with a group of Europe states, saying that they don't want to say regularization because they don't want to provoke the illegal migration. No? And some countries, as Brazil, Guyana, Jamaica, Mexico, said we cannot deport the people who is irregular. We already said that there is different causes because they are irregular, and not all have an entrance in an irregular way. So we have to solve this and make a solution. No? And this is how the negotiation is given more positions and points and breaking points, but that helps to have specific proposals and to find understanding as well. And I will finish saying that I think that the important thing now is not to polarize the room, to have alliance with different regions, not necessarily as bloc, as group, but just as countries, no? Like children, gender, climate change, labor. Try to talk with those countries, make the points, and try to link more points of understanding. Well, I will leave it there, and please, if you have any question, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Berenice, for this really, really comprehensive overview of the dynamics in the room and the different government coalitions that are appearing. Yeah, and if I listen to you well, we really are facing a divided room. But on the positive side, this group of like-minded states seems to be growing, and it would be interesting to see how African states in the next round could be linked to that group. You already touched a little bit on some of the harder issues, such as regularization and access to services for irregular migrants, and this actually leads us to the next speaker. If I could welcome Kadri Sova from PICUM to talk just a little bit about how the access to services and firewalls has been a really important and polarized debate in the room.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Sophie, for organizing this and for inviting us to give some input. So, yeah, I mean, Berenice has set the scene very nicely in terms of, you know, what the dividing lines and what the groups, how they're forming. What we can say from kind of the European perspective is that you know, for us, the discussions have actually been, and the text, you know, starting from the text, it's been very progressive. I mean, we've heard the EU say, you know, things that we wouldn't expect them to say. You know, we've been working for 10 years to get them to say some of these things, and now we hear them for the first time, for example, mentioning or even like saying out loud that, you know, many European countries give access to healthcare for undocumented. You know, it's for us, it's quite it's quite an achievement, although it might seem, you know, that the EU, or it doesn't seem, it is that the EU is still one of the most restrictive in terms of human rights for migrants, irrespective of status. But you know, just to give you that background context as well, we do see that they are, you know, they are going out of their way in many places to kind of go along with the logic of the text and the kind of the theme and the kind of feeling that was intended by the facilitators. So when it comes to social rights, I think Sophie also in the very beginning said that we've kind of ended up in a situation where, in an attempt to restrict the concept of what kind of services we are talking about, we now have these very funny different concepts like basic services, essential services, and necessary services, all in one objective, which you know, I'm sure that in the next draft this has to be corrected because it's just very it's just not clear. So we will have to see how or what is the line that we will be taking in terms of suggesting language. I mean, for us, obviously, out of these three options, essential is the broadest, I would say. Essential also alludes to the fact that it has to be the service provider who determines what is essential. At least that's how we understand it. But yeah, so there's a lot of unclarity about that. Then the issue of firewalls. Sorry, just on the basic services still. In the very first draft, we had this kind of list of different services, which received a lot of criticism. Also, ourselves, we weren't very happy with that because it could have meant that it becomes this kind of pick and choose, and so now the co-facilitators have opted to get rid of the specific mentions, but talk about services in general, and then trying to limit it with this either necessary, essential, or basic. Then for firewalls, this has been another kind of explosive issue that government started lamenting about from the first round on. Firewalls were mentioned in several places. So a lot of the governments led by Europe, Australia, Norway were saying we don't want any of this. Firewalls are completely at odds with the sovereignty of the state to determine what kind of entitlements they give, or it's also obstructing governments to fulfill their law enforcement duties and so on. So what we try to do then, just to say as well that PICOM is on a rolling basis updating a sort of comments paper where we take on board what the EU governments have said during the negotiation phases, and then give language suggestions and guidance on different issues. So what we decided to do, immediately after the first round, was that we said, okay, we need to break this firewalls concept down to explain a little bit, because it also seemed that there was not a lot of understanding what that meant. And to break it down a little bit to explain what that was. This in particular concerns paragraphs 22H and paragraph 30 and 30C, where we're actually very happy to see that our suggestions were taken up by the co-facilitators in the revised draft. So we are actually now not talking about firewalls anymore, but we're talking about ensuring public services are independent from immigration enforcement. And on the in objective in paragraph 30C, sorry, we broke it down to reporting and apprehending. So kind of clarifying what governments should and shouldn't do. Now. Interestingly, in the last round, this issue of the whole of government approach was raised, and I want to mention this because we see that it was kind of twisted by many governments in a complete opposite direction of what we meant. So we're taking this up in our new comments document as well to kind of clarify how the firewall approach supports the whole of government approach, and vice versa. That the whole of government, actually, what it means is, that all of the different government sections work together towards certain goals, which doesn't mean that this goal has to be, apprehending and deporting people, which some of the governments kind of seem to suggest. So it kind of, for us, it really means that the firewall means that the whole of government approach doesn't mean exchange of information. So we develop a paragraph on what we see the whole of government approach being. So that's one point. Then another thing I wanted to mention is the kind of argument that we've started to use now in the firewall context is the data protection argument. Just to let you know that the EU has actually adopted a very comprehensive data protection regulation that is directly applicable to all member states. And it actually is relevant to the firewall principle and what we are trying to talk about, this exchanging of information. Basically, as its core principle, it demands that data cannot be transferred or processed without a person's consent. And it sets very strict rules on kind of purpose limitations for the data that is collected. So we already got a request from the Swedish government to ask, we're still not happy with how the firewall is presented. Do you have some additional wording suggestions? So we've tweaked now a little bit of how we present and kind of explained a little bit more what kind of data we're talking about. So we're talking now about data collected for service delivery, and it cannot be used for immigration enforcement. So we've kind of even unpacked a little bit more also what independent means safe and confidential access. So I think what we also feel is that we need to explain more what we mean, that some of these concepts that for us are really common and understandable for governments, they just seem very, very scary. And I think it's a lot to do with explaining, giving good examples, kind of assuring that they are already doing a lot of this in their practice and legislation already. So that's that on the firewalls. I also wanted to just ask you to and encourage you to contact whoever is also has the capacity to contact EU member states separately, because all of them are developing their own positions towards the common EU position. If you want them to pick up certain issues or really focus on one or two issues and try to get the governments to talk up on these things towards the EU position. It makes it very difficult for us to influence, because the EU is speaking as a whole, so we never actually hear the different EU governments speak. So we don't actually know what their positions are. We get an idea from bilateral conversations, but we can't talk to everybody. There's 27 countries to talk to, so it's a massive field of work. So any outreach that you could do as well to European governments in particular would be great. And we'll be happy to share also our new comments document, which we will finalize by the end of this week, so tomorrow already. Yeah, if you want to see how kind of what the logic is behind what we are as PICUM suggesting to the EU governments and what we base our advocacy on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kadri, for also ending with a few really practical suggestions for advocacy at national level. And what I found really interesting of your presentation is also how both the co-facilitators but also states are really still looking for language that manages to read the vibe in the room and to make sure that we understand what the really complex terminology is and trying to work with that terminologies in language. So I thought that was very interesting, and I'd love to open the floor already for questions, but before doing that, I'd really like to invite Camila to talk a little bit about pathways and regularization. And if I may just ask to stick to 5 minutes, because I'm starting to be a little bit wary of the time that we still have left on this call. So Camila, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Sophie. Hi, everyone. I'll try to keep to the time. So I guess, thank you, Kadri, a lot for your presentation. I guess I'm going to try to complement it, going to another perspective of things, which is more structural, which doesn't mean that I do not agree and understand the strategy of unpacking terms and concepts and trying to find language to overcome some of the pressures to remove some of the good parts of the text, and I think Pickham has done it really well. But my approach here will be slightly different. What we're really trying to tackle at this round itself is the issue of regular pathways and regularization, which is sort of related to the more structural sense of this agreement. So in the case particularly of regularization, our main thing that we're trying to say and to insist upon is that the concept itself has disappeared from the text, and we don't believe that exchanging it for granting regular permits or residence is the same thing, because, and I'm going to explain it to you now, because the text is not clear regarding what the answer is to a pretty basic and important problem in the migration world, which is what to do with irregular migration and migrants in irregular situation. So what we're trying to bring as an argument to the next round is that there are some types of answers that a state can have towards irregular migration, right? So one of them is enhancing regular pathways for the entry to the territories. A second one would be granting access to services, as Kadri said, to people with irregular status. Third one would be to regularize those people, so to grant them regular status so they can stay and also have access to documents and then access to services. And the last one would be to return these people. And what we are seeing, if we read the text as a whole, is that although there were some good actions proposed in the latest versions of the text, and I think Pickham's work was really important to keep those. So there is an objective, which is objective 5, which speaks of enhancing regular pathways. And there is also objectives regarding access to services and also separating access to services from law enforcement activities. So these two things are really good, but then they are really limited if you look at it. If you look to it in connection with the other sorts of answers that are necessary, if the compact is really going to answer to its original objective, which is creating safer, orderly, regular migration. So what we see is that on the one hand, there is no mention to regularization in terms of understanding that most of the irregular people have actually entered the territories in a regular way. So they enter regularly and they are turned into irregular migrants because of bureaucratic obstacles and the lack of mechanisms of transformation of visas and other regularization mechanisms that can accurately respond to their concrete life circumstances. So if the compact has no mention of this, and then there is an explaining to do and some language work to do, because what we're saying is not that the states should commit to regularize everybody, like a blanket regularization sort of action, but they should, I mean, they really should be discussing, honestly, their procedures, their criteria for regularizing migrants. And in this connection, I mean, access to services is really, really important, but it's probably not enough, because, and it's not enough, particularly in light of what the text is now suggesting as their returns agreements. And I'm going to that briefly, but there is an objective which wasn't discussed in the last round because we didn't get to it. Last round wasn't able to discuss the whole text. So the objective 21, which is the returns objective, was not discussed, but it seems to be an objective mostly which mostly searches to remove obstacles to return people. So it's really problematic because it's actually really focused on the idea of voluntary return, and it doesn't tackle the issue of non-voluntary returns. And when it doesn't do that, it also doesn't tackle the issue of the necessary controls and guarantees regarding deportations and expulsions. So in light of that, if you don't have any mention to reducing irregular status and turning migration more regular, then I mean, what is the structural answer that this global compact is giving to irregular migration, right? It seems to be some sort of minimum agreement on basic services, which in the end will be always subject to some freedom of decision by the states, and also, but also, I mean, it keeps the possibility open for the states to just return people that are irregular, right? So it's a really not consistent answer when you have between 15% to 20% of migrant people in the world in an irregular situation. What are you doing to these people? Are you returning all of them? Are you keeping most of them in an irregular status with some sort of basic services until you return them? Or so this discussion got a little clearer at the second round of negotiations when states decided to discuss the differences between regular and irregular migrants, and also between migrants and refugees. I think Stefan will talk a little bit more about that. And the problem about this framing of the discussion is that it really conceals the most important aspect of these differences, which is that these differences actually depend upon state policy. So the state is the actor that defines who is granted refugee status or not, and who is granted regular status for entering and living in a territory. And when they are so focused in tying rights to these circumstances or to these categories, but not willing to discuss their own responsibility in turning people into regular or irregular migrants, then you have a structural problem about what this global agreement will be. So we're trying to work together and think about language and about explaining things such as we're not promoting a blanket regularization sort of agreement, but we want to bring this debate into the compact and really discuss procedures and criteria for regularization. But then also, I think there is really a political issue going on there, where the compact sometimes seems to be about returning people and not granting them with a permanent solution for their lives. So it's really, if like the text stays as it is, we're worried that it doesn't really fulfill the original objectives stated in the New York Declaration, which is promoting regular, safe, and orderly migration. I guess I'll stop here and then open for debate.
Thank you so much, Camila. And I think the next round will be really interesting, where we have some of the harder objectives to be discussed. And then the next new draft, we've heard quite a bit of support as well in the room on including regularization as a policy tool. So it'll be interesting to see how the co-facilitators deal with that information and that divided room in the next draft. So now I'll invite Stefan for just a few thoughts on mixed migration and protection gaps, and then I'll open the floor for some questions and reactions to the four speakers. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Sophie, and really very happy to have such a diverse group. And I must say I've already learned a lot from the other presentations myself. So I would like to go back to the origin of the compacts. I think it's important to realize that what we are doing today in 2018 started in 2015 with a General Assembly resolution deciding to convene, and I quote, a one-day high-level meeting on large movement of refugees and migrants on 19 September 2016. So why that, and why in 2015? In 2015, you will remember that it was the year during which more than 1 million people arrived in a number of European countries through the Mediterranean, and mainly through smuggling networks. It created probably not a crisis in the sense of capacity, but it created a political crisis in Europe. And European states made a lot of pressure on the rest of the international community for the issue to be discussed. So it led to the General Assembly resolution, and then to the New York Declaration. The New York Declaration is still is called the same. It's a declaration for refugees and migrants with a clear focus on large movement of both refugees and migrants, which may involve, and again, this is the language of the New York Declaration, mixed flows of people, whether refugees or migrant, who move for different reasons, but who may use similar routes. What is interesting is that during the first 9 months of 2016, you had discussion and negotiations around refugee on one side, which went relatively well, and the work progressed well, and with a number of stumbling blocks regarding migrants. So basically, the New York Declaration also reflects this kind of difference between refugees, well advanced, and migration, much less advanced. What is interesting is that in the New York Declaration, you still have a synergy between both groups, because you can see that there are exactly 19 commitments which are common to both refugees and migrants. Today, the logic has completely changed. Today, also because politically, probably mixed migration flows is less of a priority, but also because of the fear of many states that refugee language will be injected into migration. I think, in my view, this is the real fear of many governments. So now we have two parallel tracks without almost any cross-references. So today, mixed flows have almost disappeared from both compacts. It is just mentioned in passing in 3 paragraphs of the latest draft of the GCR. So we can say that at this stage, mixed flows is almost dead. I think it would be important and interesting to re-inject the issue of mixed migration flow in spite of the political difficulty for, I would say, two main reasons. The first one, because very soon there will be another major country being confronted with such a situation, and that state and the rest of the international community will be unprepared. And secondly, because by discussing mixed flows, we create natural bridges between both categories of people. There are other gaps which have appeared by a restrictive approach in either the GCM or the GCR, but I think I will stop here for the moment.
Thank you so much, Stefan. And I had a meeting with the Office of the Special Rapporteur to the Secretary General on International Migration, and they, of course, have this very high on their agenda as well. And they are probably working on some language to propose to states as well. This will not be public, but it's just good to know that also in the UN system, there's really a priority concern on this, because it was exactly this issue that was the raison d'être of the New York Declaration. So I think there's really an opportunity there for us as well to propose text and propose clear guidelines to governments, because they seem pretty confused in what we've heard so far from the room in New York. But I'd like to open the floor for maybe, looking at the time, maybe 7 minutes of Q&A. So the floor is entirely open. If you could name your name and organization and who you're asking the question to, that would be wonderful.
Hello. Hello, Sophie. This is Saiful from YB Development Foundation in Bangladesh. Thank you for all the presentation made by the 4 speakers, and I learned a lot of things from them. But first question of mine is the politics for the inclusion of the migrant workers rights convention is not included in the preamble. Even we understand that the migrant workers committee also write to the both the facilitators and also different governments, and in different times we have heard that all are recommending to include that, in particular most core convention of the United Nations for the protection of the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families are not included. What is the reason behind it? Because I think because of the irregular migrations and the protection of the irregular migrants and give them the legal supports, and also there is some articles which should be very important for the rights protection of the rights of migrants. So even when there is ambiguity regarding the regular pathways, that also comes in the discussion. So my question is that whether this like-minded group of countries can achieve this to bring these issues in the zero draft or revised draft. Thank you.
Thanks, and I'll take just maybe one or two questions, more questions before opening it back.
Hello. Thomas Matthew Kadavil from India, representing SIMS. My question is, these countries, they have a process for making irregular to regularization of the things by calling the name amnesty, general amnesty. How we can include these kind of general amnesties and include, or I mean, we can make these general amnesties as part of the regularization process, because it is happening maybe 2 years and 3 years time. It is happening in this part of GCCs, and many people are making use of this facility. So regularization process, and also it is another thing on the countries of origin. These people who are already taken, I mean, this amnesty or facilities, they have to return. They have to return to the country of origin. In those cases, their reintegration into the society is a big question. Their life and their reintegration as such is a big question. And also here, people who are regularizing, exorbitant fees are taken for these regularization processes. And as we all know, that is for the migrants become irregular. It is not because of their faults. It is happening because of the certain things which is the rules and regulations and the mechanisms. All these things are because of that only they become irregular. The migrants, I am talking about the migrants, not the refugees. So in those conditions, why these states or the governments are taking for regularizing them, for taking money for regularizing this to accommodate them or to in the countries of destinations? This is my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Maybe one more before I open it back. I also see that Helena has just typed up a question in the chat box, so I might just read it out. Or Helena, if your mic is working, you're also welcome to read it to the group.
Well, I found particularly provoking and interesting Camila's and Estefan's presentations, and so I wanted to ask them specifically whether they have concrete suggestions in terms of the structure of how these two structural issues can be addressed. I think that Kadri has given us great examples in terms of how you can work with states that have an opposition to certain issues through the wording and individual advocacy, and definitely PICUM has led the way with that. But in these two other issues, I was wondering how we can think of changing the dynamics of the negotiations so that these two issues can be addressed. Should we be advocating with the co-facilitators that they invite external speakers? Should we be speaking to specific states? What ideas do you have? That's my question.
Thank you so much, Elena, for this very strategic question. And I'll open it back to the speakers. Maybe if Stefan or Camila could react to what Helena has just asked on strategy, on next steps. And then Camila might also invite you to respond to Thomas's question on the reasons for regularization being difficult for certain governments to talk about. So the floor is open.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Thomas and Elena, for the questions. I'll start with maybe with Thomas. I don't know what the reasons are. I think the regularization issue at the international level is quite new. So I agree in some way with Beacom when they say that we are really used to thinking of this in this way, but states and mainly states internationally are not used to thinking about global agreements on regularization. So they are really sticking to the notion of sovereignty and their rights to determine who is regularized or who can enter their territory or not, and not as used to thinking of regularization as part of a public policy. But these are, the authorities at the international level, because when you speak to the local authorities or migration authorities locally, they understand, and they have actually led many efforts on regularization initiatives and programs. So I am not sure. But I also think that, so there is some like translating languages issue that we need to do to, to let them understand that their sovereignty is not changed if they discuss seriously their regularization and regular entry options internationally. But I also think that there are some political reasons for that. And then answering to Elena's question, I think we have to keep explaining in a detailed way and based on our national experience and on actual good practices by many states on these issues. So keep bringing those to the floor. But also, I think there is a need of I think we have to keep the word and keep the concepts in the room and resist the pressure to remove them or to rephrase them in another way. So it's a two-way strategy. One is to explain it, to explain we're not defending blanket regularization, to explain that this in no way changes the sovereignty and the freedom of states to determine what their criteria will be, what their procedures will be, but is to bring regularization options and policies into the room and to be actually pretty strong about this. We have been discussing this with the co-facilitators, and they're saying that regularization is not an option, and that countries such as Brazil, who are bringing it into the table, are being too radical, and that we have to change the language and change and we disagree with that. We think there is a need of being pretty strong politically in the sense of if the compact is not discussing ways to reduce irregular migration, then the compact is really failing some of its basic goals. And I think civil society must be vocal about this and support states that are doing this, because otherwise, if you read the compact in a whole of government approach and a whole agreement on answers to the migration problems, and this is ignored, then we'll have serious problems about what the sense of this agreement is. So it's both ways. It's explaining and having bilaterals and working together on language that better explains what we're aiming at, but also resisting pressure to take this discussion out of the table.
Thanks, Camila. Yes, Stefan, maybe for a few final comments?
I would like to try to answer Elena's excellent question, and I also saw that Monami sent a kind of complementary point, which is how much we can achieve with so little time remaining. I guess we need to identify the few battles we may be able, if not to win, at least to obtain something, and those we are going to lose in any case. For me, one lost battle, but I may be wrong, is that a number of states will be objecting to cross-references between both compacts. So any reference of the GCM in the GCR and vice versa, in my view, will be objected by a number of states. The same, a number of states will definitely object to using refugee protection language when it comes to migrants. So those are the kind of battles I would not even consider. For me, I see two situations or two groups where we need to really fight for. The first one is definitely migrants in vulnerable situations, regular or irregular. There, I think it's our responsibility to make sure that they are on the map and that we have a very clear categories of people belonging to migrants in vulnerable situation, and that there is a clear distinction with people under the refugee definition. But regarding refugees, we need to ensure that all people under the broader refugee definition, basically victims of violence, generalized violence, and massive human rights violation, are also protected. The new language in the recent GCR draft is not good. It has weakened. It's basically paragraph 1, and you can have a look and compare the previous draft with the current draft. There has been weakening of the language, and this is something we need to fight for. So I would personally choose at least these two battles from our own perspective, but I think child protection issues are also another battle worth fighting for.
Thank you so much, Camila and Stefan, for some strategic advice to the group. And I realize we haven't responded to Saifel's question on the Migrants Worker Convention. Yeah, Saifel, we see a divided room also on this in the negotiations. And I think that divided room just really reflects that there's no appetite from governments whatsoever to bring legally binding language in the text, even if it is if it is just a referral to, it's already problematic. And especially since this is a convention that is not widely supported by UN member states. So I'm curious to see how the co-facilitators will go about that in the next draft. We still have an entire agenda item 3 to go through. So I was wondering if you would consider staying on for just 10 minutes longer, so we can take you through just some of the activities that are being planned in the coming weeks. But before going into that, I'd really like to give Colin Raja the floor for just a few updates and practical ways in which civil society can be engaged in the formal process. So Colin, the floor is yours, and apologies for the delay.
No worries, Sophie, and thank you very much. I think the discussion has been very interesting, exactly what we needed. And thank you again to ICMC for convening this webinar. And I think it's really, really helpful for all of us to understand the different issues at stake and how to engage. But just to focus a little bit on the engagement part and where civil society can participate and really engage and advocate around the compact, especially in this midpoint of the negotiations right now. There are essentially 3 ways for us to engage at different levels. One is, of course, the thing that we've been talking most about is at the negotiations themselves in New York. And I just want to spend a little bit of, sorry, technical time little bit of time on the technicalities of how to do that, because I know that can be a little bit complex and a little bit confusing even now. So just take a minute to do that. Essentially, you need to be participating in anything at the UN, including this process. You need to have some form of accreditation. For most established NGOs and other civil society organizations, you might have an ECOSOC accreditation status. If you have ECOSOC accreditation status, most of your headaches are resolved. So that means you have a badge, or your organization can get a badge for you to access the UN. That's the best way to go about that, and then you don't have to worry about much else. You might want to participate in the registration and put that in, but that's not absolutely necessary at this point, because you can access the negotiations and the multi-stakeholder hearings and everything else. But if you don't, and this is the biggest confusing point of all, if you do not have ECOSOC status, your organization does not have ECOSOC status, you would have had to have special accreditation just for the Global Compact on Migration process. And you cannot get that now. That closed about a year ago. So the UN opened a process of getting people special accreditation, went through a whole process of reviewing this and approving them. And there's a whole list online about who's been approved for that. So your organization, and by now you should know if your organization has that special accreditation status or not. And if you have that special accreditation process, you have to do an extra step. You must register for each hearing and each multi-stakeholder hearing. So for example, we have a negotiation round coming up in about 10 days time on the 14th through the 18th of May. And then that's immediately followed by the final multi-stakeholder hearing on the 21st of May. The registration process for this closed at the 1st of May. So there was a process where you could have registered for that. Now, if you really missed the registration deadline, you might be out of luck in terms of getting a pass, in terms of accessing this. But for all the upcoming ones, which we have 2 months more of negotiation rounds, you can still do that, and you can still go in and register and do that when the registration reopens again soon after this next round of negotiations. So you need to do that and to get the pass, and the pass will be handed out usually in the first and second days of the negotiations, or if you come at a later point, you can always make one-on-one arrangements with the Secretariat about doing that. That's the primary way in terms of engagement and the technicalities of how to do that. During the negotiations itself, of course, it's extremely limited in how much you can actually give input and engage. One thing we strongly encourage people to do is actually approach member states on the sidelines and actually have meetings with them, set up discussions with them around that whenever you have the opportunity. And this goes beyond the negotiation week as well. Anytime you can get to talk to them one-on-one and bring to your advocacy points forward, that's always very helpful. But there is also, the co-facilitators have made in the past negotiation rounds a day of a 1-hour informal dialogue with stakeholders, and not just civil society, it's all stakeholders. And because agencies, UN agencies also don't have any opportunity to speak during negotiations, that's also when UN agencies speak. So it gets pretty busy now. So what they've done in this next round onwards, because we have 5 days of negotiations now, they're going to have 2 days of informal dialogues. And this next round, we'll have it on that Tuesday, on the 15th, and on Friday, on the 18th. And it's usually from 9 to 10 a.m. Of those mornings. So that's in terms of the participation in New York, primarily during the negotiations. There are 2 other ways that people tend to forget on how you can also engage. One is sending your points, your statements, anything you'd like to say, questions, queries, and anything you'd like to say to member states, or to the co-facilitators, or to the SRSG's office, to the gcmigration@un.org, and I'll type this out in the chat box in a second. But gcmigration@un.org is a very important email, because any communication, any official email communication to the process is through this email only. And I know some people are a little bit, how should you say, skeptical that, you know, this is an email that thousands of people are flooding every day. But it actually does get read. Each and every email that you send does get read and processed. And you've seen, and I'm sure people like Kadri and others can point to this, that you know, when you submit something of real value and really pointed and really specific in terms of giving feedback, recommendations, and advocacy points, it actually does get taken up by co-facilitators, by member states. It's very, very much valued. In fact, this is probably even better than making a statement on the floor, because they have time to process it. If you organize it really well, they can actually process it, and they can actually take, cut, and paste it sometimes, in many cases, into future drafts of the compact. So that can be very, very helpful, and I really want to emphasize that. And thank you, Sophie, for putting that up on the chat box. The third and final way, but I wouldn't say the least way, is something that we also tend to forget, is actually advocacy at the capital's level. And this has been re-emphasized to us countless times. When we are not in New York, actually the most effective way of advocating on anything on the compact is actually with member states at the capital level, because most of the thinking and the decisions undertaken on what states' positions, individual states' positions are, is undertaken at the capital level, and that is transferred and sent forward to their negotiators in New York. So that's really, really incredibly important. I know some of you have undertaken that at the regional level and individually at your organizations and national level, but it's something to re-emphasize again. Whenever you have the opportunity in member states' capitals, anywhere in the world, it's very important to talk to the key people developing this at the national level. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's always good to meet with them, talk to them about what you see in the compact. Sometimes it's even good education, because a lot of times different key ministries, like an interior ministry or something like that, are not even really aware of the current status of negotiations. So it's good to bring it to their attention, good to bring forward your advocacy points and push it there. So I just really want to underline, never to forget that that's always an opportunity, and even very, very valuable to do advocacy on the capital level. So I just want to pause there and leave it for that. And I know there's a lot of discussion more about what's coming up and happening. So I'll just stop right there just to say these are the primary ways I think we can participate and engage, and to look forward to continuing to support that.
Thank you so much, Colin. And we'll also share the registration link in just a bit in the chat box as well. Yeah, and thank you also for that concrete advice for taking it back to our national level advocacy, which is so important at this stage. And in terms of bringing out civil society messaging, I'm actually glad that we run a little bit over time, but I'm really glad that we did and got to look into some of the issues that Kadri, Camilla, and Stefan talked about, because I think this is a moment in time where civil society also needs to bring out some of the issues that are important for us with a strong voice, because we only have 3 rounds left. So this was really the thinking that a lot of the groups that were involved in the last round of negotiations came up with and said, okay, what can we do concretely to try to bring these issues more to the front of the negotiation. So one of the next steps and activities that we have set up is the civil society joint statement on safe access to services, pathways, mixed migration, and detention. We are still in the middle of finalizing the version of the statement, but it will be launched tomorrow for global sign-on, and it would be really wonderful if you could also pass that on to your networks and your partners at local and national level, because we're hoping to get a big sign-on to that statement when we enter into the next round of negotiations and throughout the round of negotiations as well. I will make sure to keep you posted on next steps, and we'll make sure to send you the final statement once it's ready. Maybe also linked to follow-up actions, we're going to organize a small meeting with New York-based missions and the groups here next week on exactly the same issues of the statement. We're aware, of course, that some of the positions, most of the positions, are being negotiated in capitals, but nevertheless, we thought the moment was here to really, based on what governments have been saying in the last round, to really sit with them and unpack some of the issues and discuss some of the more structural problems that we see arise. And we're doing that, of course, with the like-minded group, with the governments that have spoken on behalf of the issues that are important to us. But we're also bringing in a little bit of strategy and trying to bring some more of the silent states, some of the European states that have progressive policies at their national level, to bring them also in the debate to hope to widen that group of like-minded states. So that is another activity that we're organizing next week. But I also wanted to open the floor to other initiatives and ideas that are happening now and in the coming weeks. And if I could maybe start with asking Mon Ami just a little bit about the idea for a town hall meeting that has been on people's minds for a while now. So Mon Ami, great if you could give us a few words about that.
Sure, thanks Sophie, and thanks everyone else for a really great sort of analysis. So the idea for the town hall came up in the third round of negotiations when a number of us were meeting and reflecting on, I think, what we were just discussing before, what the direction that the negotiations are going in, and in this sort of midpoint, sort of turning point in the negotiations where we understand that we're going to be facing a very uphill battle from here, and that we're struggling to keep positive elements in the text, and still have to address some of the hard issues that are upcoming. And so the idea was to do something that's a little bit quote unquote outside activity in versus sort of the traditional inside advocacy type of activities, and for instance the roundtables that we'll be doing with governments again on advocacy points. So the idea for the town hall would be to really lift up the voices, particularly of migrants themselves, and migrant networks, and particularly those in regions and in the global south, who have still been largely missing from the broader conversations and overall, but to lift it up in a way not necessarily to name and shame governments, but really to lift up sort of a moral and political call to action on and a reminder about the commitments and the political sort of impetus for this in the first place, in the New York Declaration, in terms of vulnerable migrants and irregular migrants, mixed flows of people and gaps of protection. And to do that in a way perhaps physically in New York, with having people in the room, inviting governments, but also perhaps having via video, videos of different regions as well. Gatherings of people who would give a short testimony on a particular issue. So it will not be happening for the May round, and so my organization, the Global Coalition on Migration, would probably facilitate such a town hall, but we're thinking of doing this in the June round. And so we welcome any of you who are here in New York to sit and talk with us about it. We've had some interest from other networks who would like to engage in something that's a sort of a bigger political sort of call to action. And we also foresee some use of media and social media. And I think, that's largely been not the case so far in the negotiations. It's been very much quiet, sort of the rules of advocacy that we've been engaged in. So I wanted to put that out too, in terms of some of our thinking more broadly of how do we sort of build some momentum in addition to the national advocacy work we're doing with ministries and governments in the final rounds. And of course, that's a tricky question in some contexts of bringing political media public attention to this. But it's a discussion about broadening the ways in which we're organizing in the remaining time.
Thanks so much, Mon Ami. Yeah, and the floor is open for additional gatherings, activities, questions. before we wrap this up.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to comment on Monami's comment, and then I have something else to say before we finish.
Go ahead, Camila.
It was just to say that Sophie, you asked us about concrete language on regular pathways and regularization, and we're working on this. We'll probably have something to circulate next week, and we'll be happy to share it with all of you. It's not an easy work because we don't have a specific objective on this, so we have to sort of create language for many of the different objectives. We're working basically on the 12, the 16 on vulnerable people, to include criteria for regularization of groups, but also on the returns objective to create some sorts of controls and controls of deportation and expulsion. So we'll be happy to circulate those suggestions with you next week.
Thank you so much, Camila. Others before I say goodbye? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Apologies again for being 15 minutes over time, but I think it was really worth it to zoom a little bit on these difficult and complex themes in the negotiations. We will keep you all posted about next registration deadlines, text that's being developed, and the joint statement. And feel free to also share interesting materials as well with me. I can also spread it to the wider group. We'll be organizing a next webinar probably mid-June, but I'll keep you posted on that as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sophie.
Bye.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you very much. Bye.
റിസൾട്ടിൽ കണ്ടറിയാം